Now on Radio 4, Front Row with Mark Lawson.
Hello. The range of the musical career of Brian Eno, subject of this Front Row special interview, is shown by the range of type sizes in which his name has appeared on album sleeves. Initially, he was one of several identities alongside Brian Ferry's in Roxy Music. But after disagreements with Ferry in 1973, his name appeared alone on solo albums, including Here Come the Warm Jets.
Blank, Frank, it is the messenger of your doom and your destruction.
Although also often given equal billing with another musical collaborator, as on his 1981 project with David Byrne, In the Bush of Ghosts. Increasingly, the distinctive name also began to appear at the end of the sleeve notes, sometimes merely as Eno, when he served as producer to David Bowie, U2 and others. But he continued to be the front man on other albums, including the influential invention of so-called ambient music on records beginning with Music for Airports. Next month, Brian Eno will serve as guest artistic director of the 2010 Brighton Festival, with events including his own musical and artistic installation, 77 Million Paintings. When I met Brian Eno at his West London recording studio, I started with a question that always interests me as an ego test for professional musicians. Does he carry much of his own music on his iPod?
No, I don't have my own music.
You passed the ego test then.
Oh, is that what you do to pass?
Yeah. No, some people only have their own music or have vast amounts of it, but you don't like to look back in that way.
Well, it's not true to say that I have none on, but I don't have released stuff on. I sometimes have bits and pieces of new stuff on. Just what I like about iPods is running them on shuffle and just suddenly coming unsuspectingly to a piece of your own work next to something else that you know and like. That really puts things in a sometimes very cruel perspective, but sometimes rather flattering as well. Sometimes something starts up and you think, oh, this is good, what is it? And then you realise it's something of your own. That's a great feeling, that. Like catching yourself unawares in the reflection of a shop window and thinking, that's a nice-looking guy.
Anyone who knows your work knows you have a very sophisticated relationship with sound, and so I'm fascinated. Here we are in your studio. There are 5 portable CD players hanging about halfway up the wall. So why?
For the last few years, I've been working on pieces of music which I call generative, which is to say that I present them not as finished pieces, but as pieces that create themselves in performance. And so what these CD players do, I make pieces and then if you can imagine, I split them into horizontal layers so that a simple way of saying it is that each instrument is freed from all of the others. So imagine that each one of those CD players is one of the instruments, and they're all playing on random shuffle so that there's constantly new clusters of the various musical parts of the piece so that it's constantly reshuffling itself. And of course you couldn't do it with a piece of Bach, for example. You have to make the music that will work like that. It's modal music where any of the elements can fit over each other in different relationships. It's like you've got a pack of cards and every time you deal, it's a different hand that comes out.
And you were trying to do this kind of stuff before the technology existed. In the Bush of Ghosts with David Byrne, I was reading the description of that. You were having lots of sampled material there before sampling was remotely fashionable, but you were using 2 tape players at that time.
Yes, and it was very complicated. It does have a quite handmade quality, that record now, because there weren't samplers, as you say, and in fact, not really many people had thought of doing this idea of taking an already recorded piece of music and collaging it into a piece that you're working on. The Beatles had done it a little bit, actually, in their later work, and Can, the German band, via Stockhausen, of course, had been experimenting with it. But I think we were the first people to try to use found vocals like that as lead vocals. And I was using cassette players then, which of course are very imprecise. The cassettes never really settle back to the same place. You can give index numbers, but the counters are always bad quality and don't really work well. So I just used to sit there and play the master tape and then hope to release the pause button at the right moment to drop it in the right place. It was very crude. It would be so easy to do now with computers.
Well, just explain this. My children never believe this when I explain it, that they find a track so easily now, or even a moment within a track. But on cassette, it was just, we used to spend hours just winding things back and forth and then pressing play and seeing if you'd found the right bit.
Yes, there was no other way of doing it. But I'd been using cassette players actually from the very beginning. When I was with Roxy Music, a lot of the changeovers between songs, because we had fairly complicated instrumental formats, and from one song to another there was a lot of instrument changing. So rather than have a big gap, big sort of silence, because none of us were very inspired stage speakers, I would write a piece of music that joined the two performances. So one performance would end and I would fade up a cassette that kind of healed the junction and the long silence between that and the next piece of music, which worked very well, except for the one night when I faded up the wrong piece of music and half the band started with what should have been the next song and the other half started with what that particular cassette should have introduced. So we had 6 players, 3 playing one song and 3 playing the other, all hoping that the others were going to change.
You say in Roxy Music you were uncertain stage speakers. You were an uncertain stage performer at all. I mean, you never originally planned to be on stage. You were going to be in the back room doing the sound.
Well, I was at the beginning. In our first performances, I was at the back of the hall with the mixer and with my synthesizer and my tapes and so on. And, of course, I was doing backing vocals from there as well. So it was a very, very odd situation where the audience would be sitting watching the band and suddenly this voice would come out and the people would wheel round to see the guy on the mixer singing, you know. And sometimes people used to say, shh, to me.
Do you regard Roxy Music now as just a means to an end in your career?
No, I really enjoyed being in the band. I mean, it was a step along the way, but it was a very important one. It was quite a big step for me to take because I had been really grappling with this problem of whether I was going to become an artist, that means to enter the fine art world, or whether I was going to become a pop musician. So Roxy Music being a success kind of confirmed my decision to follow that course.
And the fashionable thing now is for bands to reunite. There are very few that haven't. I think it's ABBA and you now, but it's unlikely, I assume.
I don't want to. I don't know what would be the point of it, to tell you the truth, from a musical point of view. I'm quite happy if the rest of them do it, but I don't know what I would do.
Have they asked you ever?
It's always been in the air, you know, so I think they know that I would say no, so it's never directly asked.
We talked about in The Bush of Ghosts and the sampling. Sampling was so rare then that David Byrne, when he wrote about it, he's referred to the fact that it took a year to clear all the material because people didn't really understand how to clear it or indeed why you wanted it.
It was very complex, the clearing process. Well, in fact, of course, when I started, I didn't even think about that because the first things we did, they were just voices that I got off the radio, which was where this idea of ghosts came from. Because
in that first track we just have the newsreader. I think it's Peter Jennings. It certainly sounds like him saying America is waiting for a response, and it just over and over.
America is waiting for a message of some sort or another.
It's not Peter Jennings. It's somebody else. His name is Barry Farborough.
Oh, right.
He was one of the first sort of shock jocks, you know, a real sort of tub thumper. And, you know, I'd just come over from England. It was the late 70s, and I was living in New York. And the most fascinating thing to me was the radio. The fact that you could have a radio station run by completely mad people. And it was there, you could hear it. You could tune in and hear nutcases, rabid sort of ideologues fulminating at full volume on the radio. And at the same time, I was going through a period of really disenchantment with songwriting. I just didn't like any longer that idea that is so big in pop music, that the person who sings is the center of the music and it's about them. You know, I just thought I don't want to do autobiographical. So I thought one way of getting over that was to use voices that clearly weren't me and that clearly had been just grabbed out of the atmosphere. So it started with radio, and of course the problem of clearance, I didn't even think about it.
But even technically, again, it was very hard to record off a radio in those days. So what did you do? How did you capture it?
Well, actually, it wasn't hard because at that time, most boom boxes had a cassette recorder in them. So you hear anything you like, you just press record and you've got it. And I had stacks and stacks. I've still got all of those cassettes with weird preachers. Oh, and of course, one of the other things was that on American radio, they use a lot of compression so that the breathing is very, very pronounced. And you'd have there was one preacher called Elder Wilbur Jones, who I used to tune into, who had emphysema. And he'd go, and his breathing was the feature. It was like a percussion element, you know. And I thought, I wonder if he knows about compression and limiting. I wonder if he's doing it because he knows what the result will be on the radio.
Because you have, as I say, this very intense relationship with sound, are you like Gene Hackman in The Conversation, the sound guy in that? I mean, are you always alert and hearing things?
Yes, I think I do pay quite a lot of attention to what's going on. Now, next door to my studio, for the last few months, there's been a lot of building going on.
We can hear it in the background now.
Okay, yes, that's still going on. It's been going on for a year.
Mixer, I think. You've had it for a year.
Yeah, and some of it has been very loud because they've been drilling into the walls here. So I realized that when I was working, I was always working around the sound of the drills. So what I did eventually is I recorded all of their drills. They've got all sorts of different ones, concrete drills and metal drills and so on. And now I have a kind of repertoire of drills to draw on so that I can... Because I found that when I listened to the music that I had done with the drills running and there were no drills, the music was out of balance. So I've had to put the drills back into the music now to complete the picture. It's like if you did a painting under a yellow light, then you looked at it in ordinary daylight and you think, oh, that's not right, that's not the picture I painted. So you have to get the conditions back.
And we have to clear the drills with some building company.
Black and Decker's
right.
Decker's lawyers will be on the job, no doubt.
In the material you programmed for the Brighton Festival, there are, understandably, because it's you doing it, various links with work in the past. We talked about the importance of randomness, and that's there very strongly in 77 million paintings. But in another sense, it's autobiographical because you had that decision, as you say, when you were growing up, would you be an artist or a recording artist? And they really come together in this, don't they? Because it is art and music, but also randomness, the way in which the completely randomly generated images match with the music.
When I made this decision, of course, in fact, I only stuck to it rigidly for about 3 years before I then started doing visual art again. So from the mid-70s onwards, I've been working with light and video. And so for at least 25 years, there's been a strong current of sound and light work going on. I think it's an interesting convergence because by the end of the 70s, I wanted to make slower, quieter and stiller music, which is where ambient music started and music for airports and so on. So I wanted to make music, I thought, that had more of the quality of a painting, something that sits still and you pay attention to it when you want. So at the same time, I was starting to make, having trained as a painter, I was starting to use video and light to make paintings effectively that actually change slowly. It's painting as an event in time, as music as an event in time. So these two things came together. I was making very still music and moving paintings, and they sort of coincided.
That connection between art and music, because your art teacher, Tom Phillips, distinguished artist who taught you in Ipswich, but he's always been a multimedia man. I mean, he illustrates books and he does paintings, and so he clearly influenced you in that way, that there weren't boundaries in art.
Tom was a very, very big influence on me. And I like the fact that some of his projects are 50-year projects. You know, they started in the 60s or even in the 50s, late 50s, some of them. And of course, the one thing that he was very important for me is that he introduced me to composers like Cage and Cardew. I, of course, I hadn't had any musical training, so I didn't read notation. I didn't play an instrument. But suddenly there was a whole new area of music
As your name became established through these works in the 70s, it's this incredibly distinctive name that even now, if you put it into Google, you get you and English National Opera are basically the people who share it. Where does it come from?
We think it's a Huguenot name. So it would have been spelt in France or Flanders, Hainault, like that place in Essex, which they call Hainault here. But that same word, which is a very common Huguenot name, is pronounced Eno or Eno. And a lot of the Huguenots came over to the east of England. So we think that's probably the origin of the name. Probably some spud there saying, Eno? It's bloody Eno, isn't it?
The other one that fascinates me, and I think a lot of people, is producing. And you've produced some of the biggest and allegedly, in some cases, big-egoed performers. But that power relationship, are you able to say as producer, don't Bono or no Bowie? I mean, do you have that level of power, or are they always right, essentially?
Oh, no. It's very much... I'm very much there to express strong opinions.
Including just don't do this.
Yes. Oh, definitely, yes. So, yes, I think one of the reasons people hire me is because I'm very opinionated. And I put a lot of stamina behind my opinions. So I think it puts people in a position of... It either gives them a lot of energy to do something, or it makes them defend something. It makes them say, no, you're wrong. I can prove that this will work. And that's good as well, to be in a position where you try to push something through just to show me that you can. But I think the other thing is that I'm always interested when I hear something that I haven't heard before. And so I think in general, producers tend to encourage more of the same, basically. That's certainly what record companies like. It's a brand and they like to see it being exploited. Whereas what I am always fascinated by is when I hear something that is strange and unfamiliar. So I'm always putting most of my weight behind that. And even if it turns out that it doesn't become the central focus of the work, it certainly gives it an edge that it wouldn't have otherwise.
And have there been catastrophic fallings out with people over this?
No, not sort of friendship fallings out. There have been quite strong arguments sometimes over things. And it's generally not about the content of the work itself, but the way of doing it. For instance, are we going to work on the same track over and over and over again until we're all totally sick of it? Or shall we just put it away for a while and come back to it? I mean, one very controversial decision I made once, to give you an example, is on the U2 album, Achtung Baby, there was so much stuff and so many pieces going on, and we were all in a complete mess, very confused, and the deadline was coming up. I think it was 3 weeks away. We had to deliver a record. We didn't have a single piece finished. And I said, let's take a 2-week holiday. and I said, and don't take the music with you. So take 2 weeks off, and we come back and we'll finish it in a week. And that's what we did. And it worked, I think, because the 2 weeks off gave us time to resort everything, to reboot, as they say. Well, that was a kind of a dangerous decision at the time, and it could have been a catastrophe.
Did the record company know you'd done that?
Yeah, they were not too pleased. Yeah.
Why did you, we'll talk more about what's in Brighton in a moment, but why did you take on the Brighton role?
Last year I did the Sydney Festival at the Sydney Opera House, and I did that rather reluctantly, actually. I was offered the chance to do one of these 77 million painting shows and to light up the sails of the Opera House. And I said, that's not worth going all the way to Australia for. So gradually a festival grew up around these things. But I really enjoyed it. I liked the idea of putting together groups of musicians and finding people who I thought had been unfairly overlooked and being able to feature them. So when the Brighton possibility came up, I was quite willing to do it.
And as I say, inevitably and properly, it reflects your enthusiasms. Afrobeat reflects your interest in African music, as did In the Bush of Ghosts. The one that is perhaps going to be the hardest sell in Britain at the moment is Reasons for Optimism, which people may think is a cynical joke, but you are going to argue that we're not optimistic enough.
Yes. I think this is because I have the feeling that you create the world that you believe in. By believing in a future, in a particular future, you start to make that happen because you make choices in relation to that future. And so those choices therefore make it more probable. If you become, well, it's a typical instance of market confidence. When people start to lose confidence in the euro plummets because people see other people losing confidence, so they lose confidence. So we're all of us so tightly geared to each other's feelings in that respect. We don't operate independently from one another. We're very alert to the condition of feelings that everyone is sharing. So if we cumulatively or communally lose confidence in the future, we probably will create a future that you wouldn't want to have confidence in, a bad future. So I'm trying to kind of redress this by saying, let's imagine good futures and imagine what they might be like and to look out for beginnings of them happening. And I think there are actually a lot of grounds for optimism.
But you see, people listening will think, well, the recession, that even if we all start thinking the recession is going to end, I mean, it won't end, perhaps. We have people dying in war all the time. I mean, what can you do in these terms about that?
Well, personally, probably not very much, but except that, to give you an example, with climate change, we stand the chance there of, I think, catastrophe or renaissance. Things could go very badly wrong. If we succeed in stopping them from going very badly wrong, in order to do that, we will have to kind of rethink a lot of our civilizational values. For example, we'll have to abandon unilateralism. We can't really solve these problems nationally. So we will have to invent a mechanism of some sort of global scale where we start to learn to talk to each other, as we conspicuously failed to do at Copenhagen. So I see that as a great cause for optimism, because that means that we will start to know how to address a lot of other problems as well, global poverty and money laundering, all these things that really stand outside of the remit of any particular nation state.
A lot of the work you've done, we've talked about in this conversation, is to do with breaking rules or ignoring the conventions. So the idea that the songwriter shouldn't be the star, that music can be randomly generated. I mean, ambient music is a very strong example of that you actually say on the sleeve notes of the airport music, you can ignore this or not ignore it, which was completely against the general view of music.
Particularly at that time, because this was sort of in the latter days of punk, which was definitely not about being ignored. It was all attempting to sort of shake you by your lapels and kick you in the testicles. And yeah, so it was quite critically, it was very unpopular at the time in this country, though funnily enough it wasn't in America. It immediately found a home in America, which is one of the reasons I went to live there. Because, it's not nice working in a place where your name has become an adjective for wimpy and pathetic. There used to be, the word Eno-esque used to appear in reviews as sort of the worst condemnation that you could give to a new band for a little while in the late 70s.
And that hurt you?
Yeah, well, of course.
And ambient music now is a whole genre. There are entire radio stations and sections of record stores. But it was just an instinct you had at the beginning.
It was a bit more than that. What had happened was that, again, back to the cassette, you see, the cassette was a very interesting technology because it meant that anybody could make their own compilations from their record collections. And so with a few friends, Peter Schmidt, the artist, was the main one, we would go through our record collections and we would make cassettes for each other. Oh, you might like this. And he once made me a cassette of all of the slow movements from the late Haydn string quartets, just the slow movements. So that was the kind of thing we'd do. And it was partly a response to the LP recording industry that always assumed that people wanted surprises. You have a slow song, then you have a fast one, then you have a ballad, then you have another fast one, and then the dance one, which I couldn't bear. So what I think me and my friends were doing was finding that we didn't want that. We want to be able to put on music to create a mood and to hold the mood. And I think this is one of the cases where composers hadn't really caught up with the technology, because the composers were still acting as though you bought a record, took it home, sat between the speakers and listened to it like you would watch a film, as if you were having a sort of dramatic experience. But of course that wasn't what people were doing. They were buying a record, taking it home, doing the washing up, cooking, looking after the kids, reading the paper, with the music in the background. Now, composers, I'm sure, one of the reasons that ambient music was controversial at first was because people didn't like the idea of music being a background event, because that sounded like Muzak, which of course was...
Capital M trademark, we have to say, for legal reasons.
Do you?
Yeah.
Okay. And I didn't want to make Muzak because I didn't like Muzak, but I did want to say the home hi-fi is a different listening space from any that we've ever had before. It's a different way of listening to music, and it requires a different music, or it suggests a different music. And so I was really trying to think, what do you want when you're in your home? What do you want from music? And of course you want all sorts of things, but one of the things you want is an atmosphere. That's obviously what people use music for. And I didn't think anyone was really writing music for that. So it was really an attempt to say, here we are, a new situation, a new technology, and in music, a new technology always means a new music. Always. You know, when as simple a thing as the third pedal on the grand piano created a whole new music for Debussy and so on. The idea that you could sustain one chord and then play other staccato things over it. This created a new way of thinking about music. Well, we have those kinds of technical innovations about every day now in music, and hence we have many, many new forms of music being born.
Finally, we talked a lot in this interview, understandably, about technology, and as you say, so much is being invented at the moment, but is it finite? I mean, we've been from the LP to the CD to digital download. It's hard for me to see what the next stage would be other than people actually plugging something into their head or their brain directly. But what is the next stage, if there is one technologically?
Well, I think one of the things is the extensions of this idea of generative music. So you don't buy a finished performance. You know, at the moment we're used to the idea that you buy a record and you listen to it again and again. It's the same thing over and over. Now, I can imagine, well, in fact, I've made examples of pieces of music that don't repeat. They retain their nature, they retain their identity, but every time you play them, they're different. Okay, so at the moment, you couldn't release something like that on a CD, but you can on a computer form. So what you would buy in the future would be not a piece of music, but the seeds for a piece of music, and it reconfigures and plays differently every time you hear it. So that's one future I can see. Another future I can see is this mixed media future where you're not just buying music, you're buying something that has a visual life as well. And the third thing I can think of is the possibility that music anyway will cease to be the center of the cultural conversation, so it might not be such an issue. You know, there was a time when everybody knew really everything that was going on. Certainly in the late 60s, everybody knew all of the major releases that were happening. That's not true now. Nobody does. It's so complex. There are so many different fields, and there's kind of Scandinavian post-ambient thrash or something like that, which somebody in rough trade knows all about, but you don't, and I don't.
Brian Eno. The Brighton Festival runs from May the 1st to May the 23rd. On Monday, John Wilson reports on the restoration of some of Britain's leading country houses at 7:15.
Front Row was presented by Mark Lawson and produced by Nikki Paxman.